Welcome to the Forest and the Trees. I'm Jeremy, and I'm joined today by my friend Jeff.
Jeremy, if we were in the same room together, I would give you a sloppy wet kiss.
Oof! Wow,
But
that one's loaded.
but I don't want to make anyone jealous, so let's make sure the kiss is unforeseen, okay?
Oh gosh, you're bringing up some dicey Christian culture there, Jeff. This
Yeah,
might be
yeah.
some PTSD for some listeners. I feel like we should have had a trigger warning before this episode. That song is bringing back maybe some hurtful memories.
Yeah, but the song is so rooted in theological principles, right? I was trying to think of like when I think about God being a jealous God, because this chapter deals a lot with God's jealousy, and there's I couldn't get that song out of my mind and the controversy therein. Plus, a little bit later in Romans, Paul even commands us to greet each other with a holy kiss. So it's biblical in that sense too.
Now, is it the Crowder version that's in your head, or which version?
I'm not sure who the artist is, honestly, because it was just the worship band at my my local church that played it, and I remember like seeing the transition of the sloppy wet kiss. It was like kind of an awkward lyric that was somewhat controversial. So later they changed it to unforeseen. That was kind of how I saw the drama play out. Is that how you remember it?
Yeah, I think it started sloppy wet kiss, and I can't remember if was it like John Mark McMillan or something wrote the song. I can't even. This is off the top of my head. This is not in my notes. I wasn't prepared
Same.
for
Yeah,
this.
I didn't even bother to look up who the artist was.
So
I
I
just
think
I just
the
know it as
first
like kind
line.
of a generic like worship song that like every worship band played for a while.
Yeah, I think it started with sloppy wet kiss, and then some people were like uncomfortable with God
Too
doing
many people
that.
complained.
So
Yeah.
then it became an unforeseen kiss.
Hmm.
And you know what? I, for one, I was good with the sloppy wet kiss. I got kids. I know what a sloppy wet kiss looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. I have dogs, and
Wow.
sometimes it can be a slobbery wet lick.
Oh
That's
gosh.
that's happened to me before.
On that note, let's move on.
Okay.
Okay, so today we're going to explore idolatry in the Bible. It's fun.
Mm,
We're going to explore God making people jealous with or without kissing. We're going to explore whether or not I'm ignoring the mean parts of God, and whether Jeff can withdraw God's gifts for his life. All that coming at you today. A couple verses I'd like to set the stage with, verses 33 and 36 in chapter 11. Paul says, "Oh, how great are God's riches and wisdom and knowledge. For everything comes from him and exists by his power and is intended for his glory. All glory to him forever. Amen."
yeah. We got a rich dad in the sky. I like it. We're old money, Jeremy. It's a big, big house.
Oh,
Lots and
no,
lots of
no
room.
more Christian controversy. You've already dove into the culture too much. You can't bring up big house. That's too much.
Okay. I
That will
apologize.
that will just explode our listeners. You can't do that in one episode.
Okay.
Speaking of our listeners, we did a little poll this week, Jeff, and I think we're surprised by the results. Are we surprised? What are we feeling with this?
Well, we did. I am surprised. Yeah, I honestly thought you were going to win on this. Not that it's a competition, but last week or last episode, we got into a kind of an impromptu debate about like what's more important, the person of Jesus. You can probably guess which of us thought the person was more important versus the principles of Jesus is what I said. I don't know. Typically, I say the teachings of Jesus, but I guess the principles came out for the alliteration, perhaps.
Of
But
course.
very pastorally thing to lean into the alliteration. Anyway, I just thought, wow, this is really interesting how we disagree here. So I clipped it, put it on social media, and then did an Instagram poll. Also, just say if you're listening to this and don't follow us on Instagram, please participate in the polls. That's one of my favorite things about our podcast in general. I'd say is like that's a good way to engage with our listeners and kind of see, check the pulse on our listenership.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that was the poll. Just two choices. What's more important, the person of Jesus or the principles of Jesus? And it was a 24-hour window where you could vote. 14 votes on each side, literally 50-50 split.
Hmm.
So we've we've run the data, and we're right back where we started from.
Which is funny to me because it really is. This is what you and I have in common. This is our 90%, is that we actually like, I don't know how to word this in a way that would include both sides. We like the stuff of Jesus, right? I am more focused on the person himself. You are more focused on some of the principles that you resonate with. But fundamentally, we both are drawn to Jesus. That is, I think, our 90%. We come at it in different ways, which I think that poll illustrates, which is also interesting because evidently we are perfectly representing the listeners and the watchers of both sides. So I found that poll very interesting that they were split.
I thought it was interesting too. Yeah, in that sense, I was really excited about it because I thought, like when I first started this show, that was kind of like an ambition of mine of like, could we get like 50% like atheists, 50% Christians listening to the show? So far, I'd say that hasn't played out. I'd say the majority of our listeners seem to be Christian from what I can tell. But I mean, I don't have all the data. We haven't like polled our listeners on that. That's just the sense I get from former Instagram followers and a lot of the feedback we get and stuff. But so this was an area where it was a true split. Oh, here, okay. Well, here's an example. Was around Easter time. I did a poll of like, did the resurrection literally happen? I think, and it was like 90% said yes, and like 10% said no. Or I don't remember specifically what the results were. I mean the options, but yeah.
So we're getting back to that middle line, Jeff. We're representing everybody.
Yeah. Were you surprised with the results? Did you think that more people would lean towards person?
Yep, I thought person would run away with it.
Yeah. And what does that tell you? Do you have any reflections on what that means?
Well, again, I think that's what I was thinking about. Essentially, it would indicate to me that more people are drawn to kind of the end result of Jesus, maybe without wanting to believe or feeling that they could believe he's God. Maybe, maybe just a kind of acknowledgement of I like him. I like some of the things he did, some of the things he taught. I may not resonate with him as like Lord and Savior type of a deal, but historically, perhaps was very significant. And truthfully, I would say, like, for the purpose of this podcast, I think it's great. I love it. And if that's, you're listening or watching this and that's where you would put yourself, like, glad you're here. Like, I'm drawn to Jesus too. Now, again, I'm drawn to him as a person, as, the Lord and the Savior of my life. But I'm also drawn to all the stuff that he said and taught and did. And so we have that in common. I think I would just add a little bit to that, which would obviously be a little bit that is very significant, a little bit. But if that's our common ground of the podcast, is that we're all somewhat enamored with Jesus, sweet. Like, let's share the table over that and then explore where that takes us. I like it.
Yeah, I like it too. There's kind of a lot you could interpret within like what specifically does that mean, and like I don't know, because it kind of like makes me go back to we were a few episodes ago when we were talking about divorce. That seems to be like a principle of Jesus according to the Gospels is he's more anti-divorce than we might be now in 2023, which is just just one example that I keep thinking about where we sort of contradict there. But anyway, yeah, appreciate that. We're all around the table together, so
love it.
It's a beautiful thing.
All right, enough of the feel good stuff. Let's disagree.
Let's get back to the disagreement. Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
That's what people.
What do you got for today, Jeff?
All right, so we're in Romans 11. I'm going to start with verses 3 and 4. This is quoting from Elijah here. He's saying, "Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." Going back to Paul saying, do you remember God's reply to Elijah? No, they have 7,000 others who have never bowed down to Baal. So this speaks to this overarching Old Testament theme of like the problem of idolatry, right? Like when I read the Old Testament, to me that seems to be truly God's number one concern with humanity is are they bowing down to the correct God or not? Not justice, not caring for one another, not love. It seems like idolatry is just his number one issue. which seems weird to me. It seems to sort of contradict the things that we often attribute to God. We often talk about God. It doesn't seem to line up with the text and the big picture story of the Old Testament. A couple caveats here. One, I understand this is a complaint about Old Testament God, so I think I know how you're going to respond in that sense. Two, I'm also aware of the criticism that people will point out of like idolatry is bad because people were sacrificing their children to Baal and Asherah, and that's why it got so dark with their pagan rituals. The practices were that bad. That's why idolatry is not okay. And I'm also, but I guess I would want to say counter to that, like Old Testament God also wanted you to sacrifice animals, and then there's still like the blood atonement in the New Testament. So it seems like it's better, but it's not 100% different than those other pagan gods. And then just another thing, I just want to get out of the way there because I know many a pastor is prone to sermonize about like the idolatry of today is social media or your career or your family or whatever you think is the most important thing in your life. That's your idol. So like I understand that metaphor. That's fine. That makes sense to me. But I'm talking about the more straightforward definition of idolatry, like just bowing down to a statue of a pagan god. Like to me, this seems like relatively minor, kind of a victimless crime as long as there's no child sacrifice happening. So
then clearly there's a victim.
yeah, then there is a victim.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's my question to you, Jeremy. What's so bad about idolatry just in and of itself?
The non-child sacrificing kind, right?
Yeah.
So there's a quote I'd like to share. This comes from an author named Robert Capon. I believe the book is called The Supper of the Lamb or something like that. Really interesting, like theology cookbook, which it's worth reading if you like eating food and Jesus, it's worth reading. Anyways, he has an interesting line about idolatry that I was thinking about. He says, idolatry has two faults. It is not only a slur on the true God, it is also an insult to true things. Okay? So it's a slur on God, it's an insult to true things.
Mm-hmm.
So I think this is an interesting way of framing idolatry. I would say that idolatry is ultimately us putting our hope in something that will not deliver results. So that's the insult to true things, right? I am going to affirm something and act accordingly and put hope and trust and some type of faith, if you will, into this, and it's not real. And so what I would say is it's not a victimless crime because we become the victim of the crime. It is a self-delusion. It is, this idea of I'm putting all my faith here. And from God's point of view, for him to say, hey, don't worry about it, it's fine, would be to just be content with the effects of idolatry on God's people, right? And I think God's going, look, this is messing you up. Stop doing it. And not because, as much as we're going to see in a minute here, that God is jealous of these other idols. But I think God's going, you're screwing yourself up. Like you're putting all your hope and all your trust into something that is not real. This is going to negatively affect you. We talked about before. Ideas have consequences, right? So bad ideas have bad consequences regardless of what those bad ideas are. Now, a comparison, as I was thinking about this, and this is perhaps a weird comparison, but I think it fits. I would actually compare idolatry to pornography because whether we're talking about like images, obviously, or words in a romance novel, pornography at its essence distorts reality. So it gets you to believe, women are like this and they do this kind of thing, or men are like this and they do this kind of thing. And it creates this false world that then gets you either physically aroused, emotionally aroused, you have some reaction to this, but then you find that people don't act like that in real life. And, I've been a pastor long enough and have been invited in to enough people's real life and marriage to watch how it absolutely destroys people. And you can make a similar argument, and some people do that. There is ethical pornography that honors the people who are making it and is not exploitive. So you go, okay, well, that's a victimless crime, right? They're on board with it. Except in the same way, I would say you who absorb that, or who, are using that pornography, are now you're the victim because you're convincing yourself of this reality that is not actually a reality. And I just know, I know the specifics of marriages and relationships that have literally fallen apart because one person has become so skewed, and it can be, again, the guy or the girl, have become so skewed because they have allowed pornography to just distort reality, and they've lost any connection they have with the other person, right? They don't know how to connect. So to me, I would say that's the real negative downfall of idolatry, is you begin to put all your faith and all your hope into this thing that is not true. It's not real. And it negatively affects you because you're not going to get any life in that, but you're going to put a whole bunch of faith, a whole bunch of trust in it, and it's going to set you up. And so I think ultimately that's why God's going, look, I'm not interested in you believing false things and giving your life to false things, especially if you're the people I'm in covenant relationship with.
Mm-hmm. Man, wow. Different directions I could go with that.
What'd you think about that analogy, Jeff?
it, it's good. I feel very morally challenged by it. I definitely did not come prepared to talk about the ethics of pornography because I certainly feel sort of undecided about it. Of course, I was raised, very purity culture. Like,
Sure.
pornography is a great sin. I've heard a lot of people, either post-Christian or just always atheist or whatever, people like make the argument that that's kind of like a false narrative. Totally agree that if it's exploitative, like if the people on video are being exploited, obviously that's unethical. Whether or not it's pornography in and of itself is unethical because it destroys your own sense of sexuality or like is destructive to your partner or not. That's a really big question. I'm still I'm still kind of wrestling with and feel undecided about. In terms of Old Testament God, I guess, I mean, this gets more into like our next question, but like the sense of jealousy, like the question of like, why is God so jealous of the people who are worshiping these false gods? If like, I mean, for one thing, it's like, why, if he wants people to worship him, why doesn't he just show up and prove his existence, right? Like, it seems like people wouldn't be creating statues of other gods if there was verifiable proof that Yahweh was there and he was the true God and the others were just statues to nothing.
Well, except I
Yeah.
would say, according to the Old Testament narrative, like you think about the Israelites, they literally watched God deliver them out of Egypt supernaturally. And then that same group is making a calf out of gold.
Yeah.
So, to be fair to the narrative, at least, I would say the narrative does imply that God physically, literally, supernaturally showed
Yeah.
up. And
Yeah, that's
then
true.
within that same generation, those people are like, Moses has been gone for a while. Let's make a new idol. Let's make a new God. We're going to worship that. And, one caveat to this, I think it's important in idolatry. The idea was not that these items themselves became God. Like, they didn't think when they made the golden calf that somehow they had created a God
Mhm.
of itself. What they thought was that a God could embody that and they created a form in which another God could embody. Their God was gone. He's on the hill with Moses. So
Mhm.
let's create a space for another God to be present with us. And again, I think that's why God's like, whoa, 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 this isn't real. Like, this is like, you're literally deluding yourself. I'm talking with Moses, and then Moses comes down and he's like, what? So I think that's what's hard. From the narrative
Mhm.
point of view, they had seen, all the plagues. I mean, all of that. Like, they had seen all that, and then they're like, yeah, let's make a calf.
Yeah, yeah, that is true, and that is a really interesting component to the story. I agree with you there, and that like according to the story, like they just saw all these miraculous things, and very very quickly they lose their faith, and like is that a true statement about the human condition? you know, like sometimes
Probably.
that. So yeah, sometimes I think about that for myself of like because I'm always like harping on about like why doesn't God just show up and do some kind of miracle and then I'd be a Christian again, and that is something I think about of like am I diluting myself. Am I diluting? What's the word? I'm delusional, self-delusional there
Mhm.
by saying that, like, what if, God like cured someone's cancer and then I was like, okay, God's real. I believe in him. And then maybe 5 years later, I'm like, I don't know. You could chalk that up to something else.
What have you done
Yeah,
for
it's
me
possible.
lately,
What
God?
have you done for me lately?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I don't know. Yeah, that is interesting. I guess like it kind of a different sub subgenre of this is the second commandment, right? No graven images. I believe
Hmm.
that's the second one. And like yeah, because I've also heard people theorize that the golden calf could have like actually been like an altar or an idol to Yahweh. Like they're saying like we want some kind of physical thing to worship, so we're going to make this golden calf to worship like the God who just brought us out of Egypt. I don't know if you think that's a plausible theory or not.
I don't think that's the most obvious or most compelling reading of that.
Mhm.
I think they were ready to move on to something else because God wasn't delivering anymore and was distant, and they're like, yeah, let's go elsewhere. Let's figure out
Mhm.
who's up now.
Yeah.
And again, I think you got to realize like we have this real strong sense of who God is, at least the God we're talking about in the Bible. Like we kind of understand like, okay, that's who we're talking about. But progressive revelation, this idea we've talked about numerous times, they're
Mhm.
figuring out which God is this and how is this God different than all those other gods that we've heard about. And so, Moses is like, what do I call you? So it's like
Mhm.
even Moses is like, what name did you have? Like, what do you go by? So I think you gotta just remember at this point in the story, they don't know all the things that we know. So they're still like, okay, this God was cool for getting us out of Egypt. Now let's figure out what God could help us to the next stage. And I think it's more of a
Sure.
basic transactional thing, whereas we are more relational probably with it.
Yeah, I suppose from the ancient Israelites' perspective, they didn't necessarily see the God that was causing the plagues to be the one and only God. They probably were coming from kind of a polytheistic view of like, oh, this God is more powerful than the gods of Egypt. But
Well, they're coming out of a polytheistic country, right?
mm-hmm,
Egypt
mm-hmm,
had all sorts of gods, and so that was the air they breathed, right? They're living in that, and then God brings them out, and so they're like, all right, this God worked for us, but now there are other options. Let's go pursue the other options. And, again, from God's point of view, like these are not going to give you life. These are not. And so
mm-hmm.
I think God's like, stop pursuing this. It's both. It's a slur on the fact that God is real. So it's a denunciation of that. I don't think you're real anymore, God. You're just one of many. And then it's like this, I'm going to believe something that's not true. And so again, even like going back to the pornography thing, theoretically, and this is where there are some Christians that argue more of your side. Nadia Bolz-Weber is one that comes to mind. She has a book on sexuality. But like theoretically, if you could have a non-exploitive pornography made that doesn't exploit anybody, and then
Mm-hmm.
if someone could experience that without any reality being distorted, then theoretically I would say, yeah, then there might be room for that. The challenge is on both ends of that, it gets tricky. Like, how do you know that it wasn't exploitive? There's, you read about this industry, it's incredibly exploitive and damaging and very dark. But then obviously it does distort really easily. And so it would take someone very self-aware, to kind of figure out, hey, this is not healthy for me. And theoretically, I think it's possible. Just like you have to be self-aware of, how does alcohol affect you? How does all sorts of things affect you? I just think this one's obviously trickier, and we're probably less subjective when we come into it than we think we are.
Yeah, yeah, I hear that.
Just circle back on that analogy.
Yeah. To go back on just one more question about kind of the Old Testament narrative and kind of the dynamic of God and his interaction with his people. I guess I want to just like push back a little bit more on the prioritization, because when you look at the stories of when Israel is disobedient and they start worshiping Baal and Asherah and they're ignoring God, and then God will like cause calamity to get their attention, I suppose, right? And it seems like God doesn't care as much about the orphans and widows and whoever is being killed, starved, oppressed in the crossfire here as much as he cares about the is this tribe worshiping me rather than worshiping these false gods. Do
According
you
to the people writing the story.
According to the people writing the story. Exactly. Yeah.
To which I would say, I think they had a very primitive understanding of God. We are experiencing bad things. We must have done something to deserve it. And
Mm-hmm.
the most compelling explanation is we worship these other gods. And,
Mm-hmm.
we are quick to dunk on that, like, oh, it's stupid. That's not real. We still think like this today. I was listening to a friend, share a story about his wife the other day, and, she's having some health problems. And she had concluded, I must have done something that God is
Mm-hmm.
punishing me for.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, God doesn't work like that. You know what I mean? Was trying to like talk her out of it. But like, we still are tempted to believe that. Like, if something bad happens, I must have done something to deserve it. And I think that's the way the Israelites saw it. We just got conquered. We must have done something to deserve that. What have we done? Well, we've been worshiping Asherah and Baal,
Mm-hmm.
and so that becomes the story. Like, God gave us over. And again, I think it says far more about them than it does about God's heart. I don't think God is personally, offended. I think God's going, look, you guys are wasting your time. I've literally shown you who I am, and you're
Mm-hmm.
ignoring this and going to something that's not true. I don't think God's emotionally worked up like they portray it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I guess that opens up the question of like if the Bible is so inaccurate about God's character, why are we still using it? But we can move on to because that's a pretty good transition to God's kind of
I don't
emotional.
think it's just
Okay, go
inaccurate or
ahead.
accurate. I think it's
Hmm.
the way in which God allows people to tell the story. God didn't tell the story. People wrote the
Right.
story down, and God allowed it. And God met them and interacted with them, and that tells us a lot about God.
Right. So he allowed them to, I don't know, to editorialize, to like make it take creative liberties when they were
Which still
recounting these
happens
historical
today.
events.
I mean, you can go to all sorts of churches today and hear all sorts of things about God, right? And
Hmm.
if you went to enough of them, you'd hear very contradictory things from one church to another. If you spanned it out, it's like, well, who's telling the truth, and why does God allow it? It's like, because this is how God works. God's not coercive. God allows you to say all sorts of things, and then people have to figure out what is real, what is God really like, and that's where faith comes in.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, God's definitely a big free speech advocate. He's just like,
Big free speech.
I'm gonna let everyone say
Yep.
whatever they want, and then when the dust settles, we'll sort it all out later.
Yep, that's how it works.
Okay, yeah, we can leave that there. So let's jump ahead to verse 11. Did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? Of course not. They were disobedient, so God made salvation available to the Gentiles, but he wanted his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because of the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. So this is sort of a complex narrative going on here, but as I understand it, it's basically because the people of Israel, who are God's first choice, his chosen people, have been so unfaithful to him. Now he's turning his attention over to Israel, or sorry, I'm sorry, to the Gentiles, to the non-Israelites. And according to the way Paul is summing it up here, he's doing this as kind of a maneuver to make Israel jealous so that Israel will come back to him, which sort of reminded me of kind of like a jealous boyfriend kind of thing. Like, is God using the Gentiles as kind of his sloppy seconds to make his actual true crush jealous and come back to him? Like, it's kind of this romantic comedy of
The
errors.
Gentiles were the rebound.
Yeah, exactly. The Gentiles were the rebound. Yes, you took the words out of my mouth, Jeremy. And so this, and I feel like this kind of jealous lover analogy, Paul's not exactly using it here, but it definitely like reminds me of how that analogy is used throughout the Bible. So I realize it's a metaphor. You can stretch metaphors too far. I think the book of Hosea is kind of the biggest example of that, right? Where like the the people of God are like his bride who are unfaithful, and God is like the perfect husband or lover who is just always patient and will always take them back, kind of thing. But even in the New Testament, they talk about like God is the groom and the church is his bride. So I don't know. It's an interesting. analogy. It's when I look back on it now, it seems like there are some problematic features to it. I mean, for one thing, it seems like a huge power imbalance, right? Like if one person is an all-powerful god and the other is like us weak humans, like is that really a truly consensual relationship? So anyway, I don't know. Just complex thoughts on a complicated analogy, but do you struggle with this God is jealous lover analogy too, Jeremy? Or do you feel like I'm being too sensitive with this?
No, actually, I share this with you. This is not my favorite metaphor, and I agree with all the things you said. Also make me uncomfortable. I'm like, ugh,
Mm,
this really the best way to say it? So here's what I'm going to suggest, and you can probably see this coming from a mile away because this is
who
how
does
I.
this look like? Who does this look like?
Here we go. I'm going to say, like so many problematic things, this reflects more of the cultural understanding of the people than it does of God. I would say our guy Paul here is a big fan of this image. Like Paul
Mm-hmm.
really likes this metaphor and uses it frequently. And as I was looking this up, I found it all over Paul's writings. You have this jealousy image used. Paul really likes this, which is interesting, because a lot of people think Paul probably was married at one point and, his role in the Sanhedrin and all that. So he probably had a wife and then she either left him or he left her or whatever. So
Hmm.
fascinating little backstory to think like, what was Paul working with relationally that, he sprinkles in here. I don't know. I just think that's interesting. But here's what I would say. You can find it in the Bible. There's biblical references, but it's not a huge Jesus thing. And I was even trying to go through, and I couldn't think of really a time where Jesus hits the jealousy card hard, where Jesus is like, you make me jealous, or it's just not as much of a Jesus thing as it was, Old Testament, and then some of the people like Paul that really liked this image. And I would say, as I was studying this, I actually realized I don't think this is really what God feels. So this again is making the argument. Yes, it's in the text, but
Mm-hmm.
is the text revealing their perception of God and God allows it? Or is that how God really is? Now, let me give you three other verses that would paint a different picture. That at a minimum, we have to make room for this along with the jealousy. I would suggest we could probably weight these heavier than the jealousy and go, God's probably more like this than that. But I'll let you and others decide. So first, I'll go for Paul because Paul does have a counterpoint that he wrote. 1 Corinthians 13:4. It's the love chapter. Paul
Mm-hmm.
says, "Love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud." Okay, so which is it, Paul? Is love that God has this jealous love toward us, or is love not jealous, as you're saying in 1 Corinthians 13? Because that seems to say something opposite than what Paul's arguing here. So, okay, love is not jealous. Okay, well, 1 John 4:8 says God is love. All right, so then if we're taking those arguments, we go, well, then God is not jealous if God is love, and Paul's saying love is not jealous. And then James 3:15 says, "For jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic." Oh, like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, so jealousy, yeah, selfishness. That's not the way God does this. These are earthly things, unspiritual things, even demonic things. So I would say again, at a minimum, I think there's enough in the text to go, yeah, maybe it's not the slam dunk jealousy that we thought. Or I would say, does that look more like Jesus, or does this jealous lover look more like Jesus? To me, I go, the jealous lover doesn't, I don't see that in Jesus. I don't see Jesus playing that card, going around, guilting and shaming everyone for their unfaithfulness to him as a bride. Like, I just don't see that tone or that posture. So, like I've done numerous times, I'm going to say when we get to some of these problematic things, I think we have to acknowledge this is God allowing people to project how they see God, how they understand God. And it may be more of that. This may be way more Paul than it is how God really is.
Yeah, that's good. The First Corinthians love chapter. I mean, obviously it's a beautiful like piece of writing. Like, I don't think it's a problem that people use it at weddings. I know, like, some Bible snobs like to say, like, technically that's not about marriage. But anyway, that's cool. Like, if married people treat each other with patience and kindness and stuff, like, I think that's great. I have always thought of it, not always, but more recently I've thought of it as being one of those, like, kind of logical contradictions with the Bible, because it says, the Bible says love is patient, love is kind, not quick to anger, never jealous. And then the Bible also says God is love, but then the Bible also says God is jealous. And the stories as I read them, God seems often like he is quick to anger.
Jeff,
And
there is no the Bible.
okay.
The Bible is not a person. It is not a voice.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is a collection of stories of people who wrote down their experiences of God and about God. So even when you say the Bible says, the Bible doesn't say any of those things. People in the Bible say those things. And now you and I get to wrestle with it and go, how do we make sense of all this? Right?
Yeah. That's a good point. So I suppose that you do need to have some level of, like, prioritization when you decide, like, when two different authors of the Bible contradict
Correct.
each other
Correct.
directly. You have to just decide, one person was wrong, right?
Oh, and Paul is contradicting himself. I mean, if Paul is talking in 1 Corinthians 13 about love, and he's clearly saying it's not jealous. That's not a character trait of love. And then is describing God elsewhere using the jealous lover analogy. I would say, Paul, you're speaking out of both sides of your mouth here. Like, which is it? And again, I think this reflects Paul far more than it reflects who God really is. And so I would say you get these verses that give you a little sunlight, that there could be something better than the jealous lover analogy. And I choose to say, yeah, those look far more like Jesus to me. And so I'm going to let those carry more weight because I interpret the whole Bible through Jesus. I don't interpret Jesus through the Bible.
The other one that I thought, because I believe this is in the New Testament, right? Because it says love keeps no records of wrongs. But isn't there a spot in the New Testament where it says God
1 Corinthians 13
but isn't there a spot in the Bible where it says God has a book with all of your sins that you'll be held accountable for at the end of life? Or is that kind of a Christian myth?
So that would be, like, I think in Revelation, like the book of life, some of that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that would be kind of probably how you interpret some of those.
Okay.
Again, are we taking it literal? Is it figurative? Is it,
Yeah.
So again, I would just say we go back to what looks like Jesus, because Jesus is what God looks like. So does the jealous lover analogy, does that embody who we see in Jesus? And I would say, no, it doesn't. I don't see that in Jesus. And if someone else does, awesome. Then that makes sense to you. I don't see it. Like, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't really see Jesus playing that. And I think there are other passages in the New Testament where the writers are offering something better than the jealous lover.
All right. Yeah, I can buy it. We can just, I don't know, scrub those away. I don't know. What would you say to someone who's, like, reading these passages, like someone who's, like, reading through the book of Hosea, for example?
Yeah.
How do you, do you just kind of grit your teeth through this and be like, well, they certainly had one opinion about God? Or, like, what would you say to someone reading some of those Old Testament passages?
Again, I'm not one to throw out any of the Bible. So, you had said earlier it's inaccurate. I don't like saying it like that because I think that's a very dismissive, way to understand it. I would just say it's not the full embodiment of who God is. And so read it with the context in mind. Again, this is why I've studied it. This is why I continue to say, this is why we have this podcast, is to get into the nitty gritty, to explore these ideas, because there's so much there. And so I would say to someone, yeah, like, understand this is a common relational understanding. Like, most of us can understand the jealous lover ethos, right? Like that's a pretty universal human experience. And so if that is an image that helps someone, then I would say, great. I'm glad that helped you understand God. I would say I wouldn't stop there. I would keep going and go, okay, now I want to introduce you to Jesus and show you I think Jesus is even better than that. Like, so it's there, and I understand it, and I understand why they used it. It's a very common human experience. And yet I don't think it captures the essence of the kind of love that God has for us.
Yeah, I guess right. I guess that's part of why it kind of bothers me because like if God is supposed to be like perfect and above our like feeble human, like driven by our egos and emotions, and this seems to me as like just a clear example of where we're making God in our image by writing him as if he's just the emotional basket case the way that us humans are. You know what I mean?
Well, right, which is what we do though. We
Mm-hmm.
often bring God down to our level as we try to make sense of God. And again,
Mm-hmm.
in relationship, God allows us to do it. And
Mm-hmm.
God has been doing it for thousands of years, allowing people to do this. And so to me, I would say, yeah, it's there. Yeah, I understand why it's there. I understand why that was a common analogy. I think ultimately it doesn't capture who we see in Jesus.
Yeah. All right. I can dig it.
And sorry for
Let's
all the redeeming love fans, the Francine Rivers fans. The absolute that thing is still a mega super book. And so I'm not telling you you have to get rid of that book. Did
yeah,
you ever
they
read
just
that
made
book,
a
Jeff?
I did not know a lot. A lot. I knew a lot of friends like in Bible college who read that book and were big on it.
I
And I know
had
they just made a movie about it recently,
Oh,
which I
I
know
didn't even know
was
that. I
kind of
had
controversial.
lots of people when it came out were like, "Have you read it yet? You got to read. This is the most incredible thing ever." And so I'm like, "All right, I gotta read this." I mean, so many people recommend it,
Yeah, yeah. What'd you
and
think?
I felt a little weird because it was like a Christian romance novel. You know what I mean? And I
Mm-hmm.
was like, "This is not a genre I read." And then I remember this was before I had a Kindle, so I had a physical copy of the book, and it's got this
Mm-hmm.
girl in a dress, at least the version I did, on the front, and I felt so like embarrassed, sitting like in a Starbucks reading, like people thinking I'm reading these romance novels. Like, no, hold on. This is a metaphor of the Bible, and it's like, oh, I didn't love it. But
Yeah,
a
yeah,
lot of people, it helped them connect with God. So if it does, awesome.
yeah. Romance novels are huge, and a lot of them are. There's a whole industry of Christian romance novels. My wife used to be a librarian in South Dakota, and those were the most in-demand books were
Oh
the
my gosh.
Amish romance novels.
Oh boy.
But I mean, I haven't read a page of them, so I guess I can't judge. I'm sure they're fine works of literature.
As long as they
Who's to
don't
say?
distort your sense of reality of how real romance works.
Yeah, yeah. Do you think it's possible that a country boy like me could make it happen with a city girl like you, Jeremy? Who's to say? All right. Well, maybe we can touch on just one more aspect of perhaps distorting God's character or you know, biblical interpretation,
I'm excited for this question. Yeah,
how
let's
God comes
go.
off. Yeah. All right. So, verse 22. Notice how God is both kind and severe. Have you ever noticed that, Jeremy? He is
I,
severe.
I've noticed.
I actually never thought of that before. Thank you, Paul. He is severe toward those who disobeyed, but kind to you if you continue to trust in his kindness. But if you stop trusting, you also will be cut off.
It's a very aggressive verse.
Yeah, yeah. So this is definitely a question I've asked you before. Like, are you sure you're not just kind of cherry picking the good parts here? But I thought, I couldn't resist this verse. I found it so refreshing. Even Paul
Yeah.
notices
Oh, it's good.
the
This is
contradiction
right up
here.
your alley.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously, there are plenty of verses about like how God is love and about how Jesus is peace, love, and blah blah blah. But there's also, as we both know, a lot of violent passages in the Bible, and even in the New Testament, like what Paul is talking about here, he's severe towards those who disobeyed him. Even Jesus talks about this of like the sheep and the goats. Like at the end of time, at the end of days, you're either in or you're out, and it's bad news for people if you're not on God's good side. So that's a question I have for you, Jeremy. Once again, are you sure that do you ever worry that you lean too hard on the kind aspects of God and are just ignoring the severe parts?
No, I don't worry about that.
Okay, great.
Much to the chagrin of many people, they want me to be more worried. This is a constant, probably one of the most constant reactions I get from people, both online, you know, videos I post, my blogs, sermons. I mean, just this is a constant. Yeah, I don't think God is as good as you think he is. You should be worried about this. I don't worry about this. And here's why. I don't even have to go out of chapter 11 to to negate what Paul is saying here, right? So
Mhm.
you go, okay, verse 22 though is a slam dunk, right? Like God's this and that, and you're going to be cut off, and this is like angry, aggressive language. Keep reading. And again, I'm not even going to go outside of chapter 11. I cheated last week and went outside of our chapter. I'm not even going to do it this week. I'm going to say within chapter 11. Verse 26, Paul says, all Israel will be saved. What? That's verse 26. All Israel will be saved. Okay, Paul, you just talked about people being cut off and, these Israelites who have these issues and are not accepting it. And then you say, all Israel will be saved. Then check out verse 32. For God has imprisoned everyone in disobedience. Ooh, that sounds so bad. Why? So he could have mercy on everyone. Who? Everyone.
Mm.
So that's literally, that's what I'm saying. You can go to one verse and go, this verse says it all. Like, God is so kind. He's going to cut these people off. And then you keep reading. Paul's like, yeah, but all Israel's going to be saved. Oh, and God is going to have mercy on everyone. Like, these are literally, this is in the same chapter. Here's what I would say. I find it so interesting that we collectively think there has to be a catch to Jesus. There's just no way he can be as good as he seems. Like, what does that say about us as humanity? What does it say about us as Christians? That this is the constant thing. And again, you're making the argument that normally is made to me by Christians, by the way, which is interesting. I don't think Jesus is as good as you think he is. I think you're, and I have well-intentioned Christians who I respect and I admire and I'm friends with who look at me and think I'm out to lunch on, I just have this, happy-go-lucky view of Jesus. And I just think it's so interesting. Why do we think there has to be a catch? Why can't Jesus be as good as a lot of these verses portray him to be? Now, interesting little side note to this. Last week, we talked about the sinner's prayer in chapter 10. And I made the argument that I think it's a good starting point for a journey with God, but it's a very bad finish line. If, you say the prayer and you think, I'm good now, I'm in forever. So I posted that clip online. As I post clips every week because I just love the abuse that I get in response.
You love to stir the pot.
I do. And I get in some truly fascinating conversations with complete strangers who the algorithm brings them to me, or I guess brings my video to them. So there's this lady named Margaret who I don't think I know. I don't think I've met her in real life. So she sees this video and begins this exchange with me. She said, I agree for most people. For those that say this prayer on their deathbed, they don't get this opportunity, but I believe they will get to experience heaven. So yeah, a good starting point for most people, but at least if you say it on your deathbed, as a finish line, you're going to get to heaven. So I reply, I said, I don't think the lack of this prayer is sending anyone to hell either. Okay. To which Margaret says, wow, that's crazy. Do you have biblical references for this? Which again is the same. This is the same. No, where's the catch? Jesus can't be this good. And again, can you back it up? Well, sure, Margaret. So I give her a few. Matthew 18:14, John 4:42, John 12:32, John 12:47, Romans 11:32, 1 Corinthians 15:22, 1 Corinthians 15:28, 1 Timothy 4:10, Titus 2:11, Revelation 21:22 through 25. Just a few, right? So I give her all these verses. Margaret replies, so do you believe that people that haven't accepted Jesus as their savior and were fully grown adults when they passed will be in heaven? I've always believed Romans 10:9 through 11. Again, what's the assumption? If I believe the text, Jesus isn't that good. Sure, Jesus is attractive to all people, she says, but not all will receive him. I'm not claiming that I'm knowledgeable because only God knows all things, but I've never heard the perspective you are saying from a pastor. Evidently, Jeff, we pastors are the bearer of bad news, not the bearer of good news. So then I finally replied to her and I said, I believe Jesus will ultimately redeem all things and all people. And I dare to believe that he is that good. So I'm going to hold on to this. Yes, there are nasty versions and of God, and yet there are things that, like verse 22, seem to be really harsh. Then there's also other verses that would imply just the opposite. And so, when in doubt, I dare to believe that Jesus is as good as I think he could be. I don't want to imagine a better Jesus than the one I actually believe in.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So to that, first of all, like I like that about you. I like that you have the positive view of God, and it's something for the most part I agree with. Like for me, I don't even see like cherry picking out of the Bible as a bad thing, like the way I used to when I was a more conservative Christian many years ago. I feel like it's okay to just take like the love is patient, love is kind verse and just run with it. That's a beautiful piece of writing. But when you say like I don't want to imagine, I wish I couldn't imagine a better view of Jesus or whatever you said. It's like it's not hard to imagine like the Bible being better than it is, right? Would you agree with that statement? Like it would be
I don't
very
know if I
easy.
would, because
It'd be
I
very easy to delete just some of the really problematic, really bad stuff. You know what I mean?
sure, and at a service level, yes, I would agree with that. At a deeper
Mm-hmm.
level, I would say no, because I find it so fascinating that God allows that. So again, the fact that God is so secure in who God is, that God
Mm-hmm.
would allow the people that God is in covenant relationship with to believe these things and say these things and represent these things. And God continues to allow it today with all sorts of Christians saying all sorts of things about God. And again, I've probably said all sorts of things about God that God's like, what on earth
Mm-hmm.
is he up to today? But I haven't been smited yet. And God
Right.
allows that. And I think God is so secure in who God is. God is the abundance, the overflow, all that is truth, all that is beauty, all that is good. And God is just constantly trying to get us as close to that as God can. And so the fact that the Bible is written the way it is, the more I study it, the more I just reflect on that. I think it's beautiful. It's bizarre and it's not easy. And yes, there are a bazillion easier ways God could have done this. For
Mm-hmm.
sure, agree with you there.
Mm-hmm.
But there is something bizarrely beautiful about the way God chose to do it. And I would say at a simple level, it's the fact that Jesus chose to teach in a parable over 10 axioms. And I like that about God. And would it be easier to just give us 10 axioms like God did in the Old Testament with the 10 commandments? Yeah, that'd be easier. But God didn't do that. Jesus says, no, I'm going to tell you some stories. I'm going to invite you to follow me. Well, that's messy and weird and confusing and vague and abstract and all these things. And then we all get to do it together in humility and figure out how to do that. So I actually find it beautiful.
Hmm. Yeah, again, when you say that, like on one level, I agree with you of like the mysterious kind of postmodern nature of the Jesus philosophy. I think is really interesting and fun to talk about. Like you and I, like we're just having fun here, just having these conversations. But throughout human history, like people have suffered. Like people have died, and like women have been oppressed because of like the writings in the New Testament.
Do you think people would not have suffered and been oppressed if there was no the Bible?
I think they would have. Yeah, but at least God's name wouldn't be on it, At least that would be on us.
I think it is on us.
Mhm.
That's my point. Just because
Mhm.
we attach God's name to it doesn't mean it's on God.
Mhm.
You go kill someone in the name of God, that's not on God, that's on you.
Mhm.
And I believe that. So I don't care if you slap Christian fish on it, or that I think that's what blasphemy is when we start bringing in God's name and God's endorsement and all kinds of horrific stuff that God has no business in at all, and we say this is of God or God told me to do this, and people have done it forever, but that's not on
Right.
God, that's on us.
But
And
does but
if we
does that
didn't
mean
have the
then the
Bible, we
actual
would have done it and blamed it on something else.
Wait, but doesn't that mean like the actual text of the Bible is blasphemy? Like the large chunks of the Bible are blasphemous, just the writing itself, you know what I mean?
I mean, from that point of view, it could be, yeah,
Yeah.
because again, there are contradictory things. So unless it's perfectly displaying who Jesus is, you're attaching something that is not of God. And again, I think blasphemous is obviously a very hotbed word,
Mhm.
but we all do this. We all attach things of what we believe to God, thinking that it's true. And
Mhm.
some do it worse than others, but God has allowed it. And I think the point is, don't attach these things to God. Figure out what God is actually like, and then go join God in what God is inviting us to experience. And no one gets it right. And so I don't want to imply that, yeah, I've got this dialed in and I know exactly how to. I don't. And I'm doing the best I can. I try to read through these things and go, yeah, this is some tricky stuff and hard stuff. And yeah, I believe that God looks like Jesus. So I just keep going back to that. I go, how do I make sense of this? How do I make sense of that? So literally, all right, how do I make sense out of idolatry if God looks like Jesus? How do I make sense out of this jealousy if God looks like Jesus? How do I make sense? I
Mhm.
just go back to like, okay, I'll just keep plugging away at it and doing the best I can, knowing my theology is not perfect and Jesus still loves me and I'm in a relationship with God.
Yeah, that's cool. I appreciate that. Am I in a relationship with God, Jeremy? Still?
You,
Isn't that your next question for me?
well, there was a verse that I thought I would be curious your take on this in this season of your life. And so
Mhm.
we're getting to the end here. Verse 29. Paul seems to make a pretty bold, it was a pretty bold statement, I think. Not quite verse 22 level bold, but just a pretty emphatic statement that I'd love to hear Jeff's theological take on. Verse 29 says, "For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn." To which I say, all right, Jeff, what do you think about this verse in light of your own journey?
Mm. Yeah. Well, so first of all, I'd say like in context, he's mostly talking about Israel here, right? Like saying like that's God's first love, and he'll never abandon them fully because
Sure.
they'll come back. But okay, in terms of like what does it mean for me? I'd say like yeah, I probably in a former life would have interpreted this verse to mean an argument for once saved always saved, right? This idea that to go back to the sinner's prayer idea, like because I prayed the prayer, even if I live a life of sin, I'm secured forever because of that or something.
Yeah, we fixed that in chapter 9.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And I guess like now I would probably interpret it more as an argument for universalism. Like if the Bible is true, or like if what Paul's saying here is true, and God's call can never be withdrawn. So like maybe that means like even though I'm like in this life I'm not like following God or whatever, maybe he'll reveal himself a little bit more clearly in the next life, and I'll follow him then.
Interesting.
Yeah. And I don't know. And then in terms of like what the other way I tried to think about the question is, uh, was I ever called? I mean, that's of course like a big question that we talked about last time about like childhood indoctrination. Like I truly would say I didn't really have a choice about whether I was going to be a Christian or not as a child. I did have a choice like in my 20s when I entered adulthood. A lot of my youth group friends went to secular college instead of Bible college and kind of like became like just normal people, not Christians anymore. And
Normal people?
yeah, and at the time I totally judged them for it, and I was praying for them, and I felt pity for them, that they had fallen to the ways of the world, and now I feel like, oh, I am my friends in their early 20s, just 10 years behind the curve.
Just took you a little longer.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Was I called? Was I just a product of my own upbringing, and I just embraced it harder than some of my other friends did at the time? These are big questions. I don't know. Did I feel like when I try to think of like what's the clearest time I felt a calling? You know, like I remember one time when I was a really little kid and I had these Legos and I set them up to spell out the word Lego within the bricks, so it was like a field of red bricks, but then just the white forms the letter L. And I had them stacked up, and at one point, like I knocked them over, and it fell off of my shelf, and just the word go was preserved because the L and the E were gone. And this is how my Christian indoctrination brain, little kid mind thought at the time was like, that's God telling me to go. God wants me to be a missionary.
And then I moved to Africa.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then like fast forward many years later, I think like missions work is very problematic in a lot of ways. I don't know. So why do I bring up that story? Just to say like that's it's so easy for us to like make sense of things after the fact. Like our minds are meaning making machines. So
Hmm.
like, was I called? Was I always supposed to be a Christian? Did God want me to start this podcast so that Jeremy could clear everything up for me, and then I could like come back into the fold? I don't know. You could certainly argue either way. What do you think?
Would you say that you feel like a sense of closure with you and God, or like, whatever I had, I feel like that's done, that's wrapped up, like I've moved on, or like it's still, whatever that is still lingering?
I'd say it's still lingering for sure. And like I've talked about this before too, of like, is it just kind of a sunk cost
Hmm.
type of thing of thinking like because I was so invested, because I had all this time invested into like studying the Bible and like wanting to worship God and whatever, um, throughout a huge chunk of my life, am I just thinking like I need to continue to explore this stuff because it can't all be for nothing?
Hmm.
Or part of me thinks like, am I still drawn to it because so many of my friends and family members are still like very serious, very devout Christians, and I want to like relate to them. I want to like know how they think and relate to them. Yeah, there's certainly a part of me that thinks like maybe this is a mistake. Maybe I should cut my losses and move on. But yeah, for whatever reason, I'm still here, still talking about it.
For God's gifts and his call can never be withdrawn.
Yeah, yeah.
You're living proof, man.
Yeah, I am. I guess to be fair, there's plenty of other people who were raised Christian and did just walk away
Hmm.
and never look back. Obviously, those people can speak for themselves in terms of what what they feel about spirituality or where they stand with God in their life. But yeah, I don't know. I'm still curious for sure.
And I love that about you. And, I think that's what should be the goal for all of us, wherever you landed on our 50-50 vote. That should be the
Hmm.
goal, is like, stay curious, keep asking the questions, keep exploring. The moment we get to the place where like, I've got this all figured out definitively and I'm not asking any more questions, that's a bad place to be. And I love the fact that I know like, hey, that's an interesting verse. I wonder how someone would read that who isn't actively pursuing God anymore. It's like, and I get to hear
Hmm.
your take. And I think that's what makes this so interesting.
Yeah. Did it have
So
a
thanks.
good interpretation? It wasn't too heretical for you?
Oh, I mean, it's full of heresy, yeah, but that's what I love about you.
Yeah, yeah. I can engage in some self-flagellation later, maybe to atone for my sins. Yeah, beautiful. Anything else you want to say about chapter 11? This was an enlightening discussion, Jeremy.
I
I
like chapter
feel
11. Yeah, that was good.
mm-hmm.
Our next
Yeah.
our next couple are going to be doozies
Oh yeah, when is the trifecta? When does that start again?
next week.
Next week?
Yeah, the
Oh.
trifecta starts next week. If you remember the very beginning of this, when I set out the Romans trifecta, we're getting to the next 2 weeks are two of the chapters. So here
Wow.
we go.
Beautiful. Yeah. Buckle up everybody. All right. Yeah. Thanks everyone for listening. And thanks again to everyone who voted on Instagram. If you're not, please follow us on Instagram to participate in our
Shameless plug.
polls. Shameless plug, yeah. And give us a rating. We're not going to complain about that either. Give us a
We appreciate
review.
your 5
Subscribe to our
stars.
YouTube.
Yes.
And thanks again for listening. See you next week.